I thought it was overshadowed. Maybe his master's degree for the supply point.
In Atlanta? Yeah. Oh, so you rearranged the flight? The state. How many visas?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, I will try and speak as loudly as I possibly can. This is the mic that Rabbi Klein usually uses for Torah study, so I thought it would be fine. But if it's not, I'll talk to James and we'll get another mic. All I can do. Hi everyone, welcome, good afternoon. My name is Jane Rothstein. I am the librarian and archivist here at the Temple, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today to hear Roy Schwartz talk about his book, Is Superman Circumcised? The Complete Jewish History of the World's Greatest Hero. This event is part of Superman's Cleveland Lineage and Legacy, which has been a 2-month citywide series of events coordinated by Valentino Zullo at Ursuline College and Donald Boozer at the Cleveland Public Library to celebrate the 85th anniversary of the Man of Steel, the world's first superhero, the creation of 2 Jewish teenagers from Cleveland, Ohio, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. I was really thrilled to have Valentino and Vera Camden reach out to us, and we're honored to be able to be a community partner for Superman's Cleveland and to be able to bring Roy here. I also want to thank everyone at the Temple who's been involved with this, because they've been amazing as we go back and forth and try to set things up. So I'll just say a little bit first. So the historian in me wants to point out that Jerry and Joe were the highlight of the program for the February 1941 annual father-son, mother-daughter banquets at the Temple in our former home at East 105th Street and Ansel Road. The program also included a magician, ventriloquist, acrobat, accordionist, and several short films. The Jewish Independent reported that Mr. Schuster, whose name they spelled incorrectly, made several sketches of Superman while Mr. Siegel answered questions about the character. I love this. Several sketches and original manuscripts were contributed by the creators as gift prizes. So if any of you had members of your family who might have gone there, you might want to recheck your attics, because you may have some cool originals there.
And if you do, they're not worth anything, just send them to me.
The fan in me has to admit that my first encounter with Superman was not in the comics, but rather in Saturday morning cartoons, which of course don't exist anymore, watching Super Friends, and my favorite was not Superman, it was the Wonder Twins. Wonder Twin powers activate, yes. Form of an ice sled, shape of a tiger, something like that, which my sister and I loved. We did the Wonder Twin powers often. But if there were no Superman in 1938, there would be no Wonder Twins in 1977. Roy Schwartz is originally from Tel Aviv and grew up a voracious reader of everything from Israeli novels to British plays to American comic books. He taught himself English from comics and cartoons, which is why he's comfortable saying things like,
Swell, great Scott. True story.
Roy's book, Is Superman Circumcised, won the 2021 International Diagram Prize for Oddest Book Title of the Year, but also been welcomed by many great reviews. He writes about pop culture for various venues, including CNN.com, and he is one of the creators of a new exhibit at the Center for Jewish History in New York called the Museum and Laboratory of the Jewish Comics Experience, and it's going to be one of the highlights of an upcoming conference at the center, also called the Jewish Comics Experience. It'll be up through the end of the year, so if any of you have a trip to New York planned, go and visit it, because it'll be amazing. Roy's book began as his thesis for an interdisciplinary MA in English and social thought at NYU, and he continued to research and expand it for several years afterward, supported in part by a writer-in-residence fellowship at the New York Public Library. In her review of Is Superman Circumcised?, our own Samantha Baskin wrote, "The title of this book should not prejudice readers. This is a serious study of Superman and at the same time a broader examination of why and how Jews have had such a crucial impact on the comics industry from its inception. Schwartz engagingly parses the intersections of the Superman mythos, theology, American history, and Jewish tradition and culture. His thorough knowledge of Superman's iterations by different creative teams from the golden era of comics to the current moment, and of the character's forays into radio, television, and the big screen is truly impressive." So please help me welcome Roy Schwartz.
Thank you, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to Jane for making this possible and creating this program, right? And we want to say something about this amazing piece?
So one thing I want to say is we have a wonderful, amazing artist who is a congregant, a Temple member, Roy Davidson, who one day surprised us with this amazing piece of book art that we've had on display in the library, and now we get to show to Roy and to all of you, who are live streaming this or maybe watching it later. Just so thrilled that Roy was able to do that for us. It was a great surprise. So, thank you. Absolutely. Take it away.
I shall. So while you don't have to look at a screen, I do have all kinds of fun slides, because what lunatic would talk about comics and not show you comics? So I just want to make sure everybody can see the screen. Can anybody not see the screen?
I can't see you.
Subtlety is key here, you know. I am Roy Schwartz, author of Is Superman Circumcised? The Complete Jewish History of the World's Greatest Hero. I write about pop culture for CNN, and about pop culture from the Jewish angle for The Forward and other odds and ends magazines and such. And you may have come across it. It got a decent amount of press. It won the Diagram Prize for oddest book title in the world, 2021. And I am shamelessly prouder of this than I ought to be. You know, there are millions of people, thousands, who have won the Pulitzer. Anybody can do that. But oddest book title in the world, that's special.
Roy, if the guy's penis was invulnerable, how could he ever be circumcised?
Oh, well, I'm glad you asked it. It's not Q&A. And I promise he's not a plant. He's actually, it's organic. So I'm glad you asked it. I shall tell you. So, listen, I don't want to break anybody's heart, but the book is not literally about his schmeckle. Okay? The book has 106 images. None of them are of schmeckles. Sorry. If you want to leave now, understand. But I'm constantly amazed. Aside from everybody taking me aside to tell me the circumcision joke at the end of every talk I give. Aside from that, I was amazed by how many people literally think this is what the book is about, which is insane. I always say, do you think To Kill a Mockingbird is about animal abuse? Like, what is it? But anyway, I get asked this question way too often, and sometimes in jest and sometimes in seriousness. So I eventually came up with an answer, and it's this. If you're familiar with the mythology, Superman was born on distant planet Krypton, where his father was named Jor-El, and his birth name was Kal-El, and he was circumcised by Moel. It's an old man joke, but I'm very proud of it, so thank you for laughing. But seriously, this guy is Jewish? And the answer is yes. Superman, the very first superhero, that's where superheroes get the super from, and arguably the greatest hero in all of fiction ever is Jewish. It's a Jewish character, rich with Jewish symbolism and themes and metaphors. And we're going to go on that journey today. And the greatest superhero in comics is based, first and foremost, on the greatest superhero in Judaism, Moses. Now, some of you may have already heard of these parallels, so bear with me. We're going to start at the beginning, bring everybody up, and then break new ground. Okay? So, Superman, as we said, was born on distant planet Krypton to Jor-El and Lara, and they named him. Does anybody know Superman's birth name? His original name? Kal-El. And what is El in Hebrew? God. The dude's name is God in Hebrew. Okay? The name of several angels and prophets in the Bible are what's called theophoric names. Theo like theology, like theos, meaning they bear the name of God. Gabriel is Gabriel, right? Daniel is Daniel. Michael, Michael. Israel, Israel, they all have the name of God built into them, and so does Kal-El. Now, some people have claimed that the full name Kal-El means voice or vessel of God or all that is God. I think that these interpretations are specious, and I think shoving too much, shoehorning too much meaning into things, it just waters what's actually there down. The guy's last name is El, and that's enough. By the way, Moses, who he's based on, also has a theophoric name. Moses breaks down Moshe, right, in Hebrew. Mash in Hebrew is the root of to be extricated or delivered or pulled out of. And He is Adonai. It's one of the names of God. Moshe in Hebrew is a theophoric name, means somebody who is extricated, delivered out of, but also extricates and delivers. He's somebody saved by God and a savior in the name of God. He's delivered from death and from the waters of the Nile, and he delivers the Israelites from bondage into the promised land and from idol worship into God's law. So that itself has a beautiful meaning. The origin story of Superman is where these parallels are the most obvious. What's the origin story of Superman? To save their baby from certain doom, right? His parents put him in a small vessel. They sent him adrift to an unknown fate. He lands in a foreign place among thick vegetation. He's found and raised and renamed by people not his own. That's Superman, and that's Moses. It's the same origin story. And that's the easiest one. And that's been talked about. But what hasn't been talked about is that their chrysalis stage, their teenage years, parallel too. Has anybody here never not seen the Christopher Reeve Superman film? Good. So in that film, when he's 18, he goes on a walkabout. He hears a calling. And he crosses the wasteland, except instead of the desert of Midian, he crosses the North Pole. Whereupon he encounters he finds the Fortress of Solitude, it's created, and he finds the bright apparition, the hologram of his father Jor-El, right? And Jor-El reveals to him his special heritage, where he's really from, where he gets these abilities from. And he sends him back into the world as a mighty, miracle-performing savior. And that part of the story was proven so popular, it got folded into the comics, so it's canon now. That is Moses crossing the desert of Midian and coming across the burning bush, where a bright apparition comes out and says, I'm the God of your father, instead of your father, and does the exact same thing. One manifests out of fire, the other manifests out of ice, but it's the same thing. And even their speech is very similar. In the movie, it says, I am Jor-El, I am your father. They can be a great people, Kal-El they wish to be. They only lack the light to show the way. For this reason above all, their capacity for good, I have sent them you, my only son. We compare that to Exodus. I am the God of your father. I have surely seen the affliction of my people. I have come down to deliver them. Come now, and I will send you, that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel. It's almost verbatim. But Moses, even though he's sort of the first blueprint, is not the only Jewish hero from the Bible that Superman is based on. Another one is Samson. And Jerry Siegel, the co-creator of Superman, we're going to get to him in a minute, he wrote a memoir that never got published, and it got lost. It was found in 2011, which is pretty recent, and barely excavated for information. And he acknowledges in this thing that one of his main inspirations was Samson. And if you look at the original comics of Superman from the late 30s and early 40s, Samson is constantly referenced. Superman is the modern Samson. He has the might of a dozen Samsons. This cover of Superman number 4 is a conscious and deliberate homage to the story of Samson. Now, Samson, known in Jewish tradition, by the way, as Samson the hero, right? Shimshon Hagibor, right? He's known for his super strength. He tears a lion in half. He smites 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. He knocks the temples, right? The pillars of the Philistine temple. But Samson also had super speed. The Bible tells us that he runs after and catches 300 foxes because he had super speed. And there's a Midrash story where he leaps in a single bound from the ancient towns of Tzo'ah to Eshtaol, which is about 4 miles. So he could also do that. And here's the thing, remember, Samson, for all of his prodigious strength, he was a judge. He fought in the name of truth and justice. So despite these perils, only a bissel that we got into, Superman in the public conception is usually associated with Jesus Christ. And it makes sense, right? If you have Jor-El and Kal-El, then you have somebody named God sending their son from the heavens, who's named God, to kind of save us from all of our foibles, whether it's Lex Luthor or whatever the case. It's hard not to see that as a Jesus metaphor. But the truth is that these themes, which are as legitimate as anything else, I will accept it all, were really added decades after Superman's creation by other creators, mostly, well, some of them Jewish, and mostly not in the comics. There's nothing Christological in Superman's comics well into the 90s. And this guy showed up in the 30s. It's all Jewish metaphor. And then in the movies, this is Batman v Superman. We see Superman in this kind of salvific imagery. He's hovering with a nimbus behind his head. It's from 2013. This was a promotional poster for Smallville in 2001. He's literally crucified, right, to a cross. We have Superman Returns from 2006, where his mother cradles him like a pieta. Can you guys see in that corner? Also from Superman Returns, Lex Luthor stabs him in the side with a shard of kryptonite, like the Spear of Destiny. And Jesus, he throws him into water. It's the whole thing. And then we have the Henry Cavill Man of Steel from 2013, where it's copious with Jesus imagery. There's glass stained windows of Jesus with a red cape and all these kind of things. And my personal favorite is this crucifixion pose. So this is Smallville. You can't see the laser. Okay, this is Smallville. This is Superman Returns, and this is Man of Steel. And on the spectrum between Moses allegory to Jesus allegory, the more you move toward Jesus, the less and less subtle it becomes, right? But, as we said, Superman was created by two Jewish teenagers from right here in Cleveland. I'm sure you've heard of this part, right? From Glenville. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Jerry Siegel wrote the stories. Joe Shuster, basically today we would say co-wrote the stories and drew them. There was a collaboration. Jerry Siegel's family they were immigrants from Lithuania. He was first generation American born in Glenville. The family was Segalowitz. Joe Shuster himself was an immigrant. He was born in Toronto. The family came from Crimea and Rotterdam in the Netherlands. So he was Dutch Ukrainian. And maybe a little bit Turkish. That's a whole new thing. And they were Shusterovich originally. Eventually they met in Cleveland in 8th grade and became best friends at first sight. And together, at the tender age of 17, they created Superman, the world's first superhero. But they didn't just create Superman, this guy. They also created his alter ego, Clark Kent, the first meaningful secret identity in fiction since Queen Esther, basically. Okay? Right, Hadassah and Esther. And
I didn't hear the last time.
the first meaningful secret identity in fiction since Queen Esther. So you had people hiding their identity, but not both sides of identity didn't mean anything. One was just a mask. It didn't have any meaning. This was the first one we can find, as far as I see it. And Siegel and Shuster based Superman on Moses and on Samson and on other inspirations, but Clark Kent they based on themselves. And they said so in countless interviews and articles and memoir bits and all that kind of stuff, that Superman was their fantasy, their wish fulfillment, but Clark Kent was their reality. And what is Clark Kent? He's this Shlomiel Shlemazel, shy, stammering. He's Woody Allen. This guy, right? Minus the problem parts, right? Right. Well, it depends. I think he was great. So he came up with this idea in 1934. There's a whole evolutionary tree of it we're not going to get into. As far as we are concerned, 1934. And they love this idea, and the two boy chicks start shopping their idea around. Nobody wants it. For 4 years, from 1934 to 1938, they pitched Superman to every single newspaper syndicate in the United States, and they all turned it down. And Sieg actually kept a lot of the rejection letters, and I got my hands on them and read them, and it's an amazing, amazing historical document. The idea didn't have lasting power. It didn't have appeal. My personal favorite from King Feature Syndicate, are you ready? Are you all sitting down? It's too fantastical, kids would never relate. How amazing is that? Here's the thing to understand. It's 1934, 1938, right? You have pulp heroes. It's like swashbucklers and pirates and federal men and cops. This is a guy who can punch down buildings and bullets bounce off his chest. And he flies through the air, but he's from outer space. And he wears long johns and underwear on top and a cape. And that's a Meshuggah idea. People didn't know what to do with this. It was completely novel. But one more thing happened in 1934, and that is the comic book was invented. This is Max Gaines, born Maxwell Ginsberg, an unemployed school teacher from the Bronx. It's the Great Depression. Nobody has a job. He's unemployed. He has to move in together with his family together into his mom's house. She's a Yiddish mama. She nags him, when are you going to find a job? Maybe you can clean the house. He hides in the attic from her. That's how the story goes. He's not clean the attic. He doesn't clean the attic. He starts rummaging through old boxes, and he finds himself reading old newspaper comic strips that he kept as a kid. Back then, if you know, there was a daily newspaper strip in black and white, and once a week on Sunday, you had the Sunday Funnies, like the full page in color. So he kept them as a kid, and he started rereading them, and he found himself enjoying them. And an idea came to mind, a light bulb, like in a comic book style. I say, what if I got all these and put them together in a magazine, in a reprint magazine, and sold it for a dime? Wouldn't kids be willing to part, with their allowance money instead of waiting for mom and dad to finish with the newspaper? So with that genius idea, he went to the newspaper syndicates. He licensed the old comic strips. They didn't care. He put it in a magazine, and he started selling them, and the idea caught on, because kids like comic books, guys, right? So it starts blossoming and becoming a small cottage industry. But a couple of years in, they start running out of material, because how many comic strips could you cut and paste before you run out of material? So they started commissioning new content. And by the way, comic books are called comic books because originally they were all comical, they were all humorous. This is recognized as the very first comic book ever, Famous Funnies #1, July 1934. As what Jane said earlier, if you have a copy, it's not worth anything, send it to me. Okay? In one such company, particularly kind of experimenting with things like detective fiction, suspense, was called Detective Comics. Today we know it as DC. Okay? And they were coming up with a new anthology called Action Comics. An anthology meaning it was a thick 64-page comic book, different people wrote different short stories. They were 13 pages short. They didn't have a story. Printer was already booked, deadline was looming. What do? You go to the slush pile of what you rejected, you pull something out randomly, you throw it in, you go to print, who cares? You with me? And so, in June 1938, by complete accident, practically, Superman debuted. This is first appearance, Action Comics #1. Again, worth nothing, sent to me, please, thank you. As it turns out, it's not too fantastical for kids to relate to, or for adults for that matter. Now, I want to give you a scale. Up until then, the best-selling comics reached 200,000 copies. A couple of mega successes reached 400,000 copies. That's like unheard of. Superman sold 2.2 million. By 1942, he was selling 12 million. How is that? 1940, just a year, still the Depression, tail end, but still the Depression, just a year and a half into his existence. He's a toddler, he's 18 months old, Superman. He gets his own radio show, The Adventures of Superman, right? Listened to by 4.5 million people. Now, the entire United States population in 1940 was 132 million. So all these numbers, you have to multiply by 2.5, right? This radio show lasted 2,088 episodes. Imagine that today. You can't see the thing. Okay. He starred in animated shorts, the Fleischer cartoons. No TVs. They were shown in movie theaters before movies. These were film noir, a decade and change before film noir had a name. And they were watched by 20 million Americans. The newspaper syndicates, the one that all of them rejected Superman, 230 newspapers published Superman regularly, reaching 25 million Americans. He was the star attraction of the World's Fair. They had a dedicated Superman Day that broke all attendance records. He was a balloon in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. Time magazine that year called him the #1 juvenile Vogue in the United States. This is 1940, all of it, just a year and a half since it debuted. Now, at this point, Siegel and Shuster, they were 22, 23. They're making good money, certainly for, high school educated Jews in the Depression. Everything is good. They start buying homes for their family. Everything is fine. They could rest on their laurels if they wished, but they did not. Because they created Superman with a purpose. There's something broiling in their kishkas they had to get out. And that was a reaction to the rise of Nazism and anti-Semitism. And so, on February 27th, 1940, they published a 2-page story in Look magazine. Look was like a competitor of Life magazine back in the day. And it's an imaginary story. It's not canonical. It's sort of what if, right? And in it, it's how Superman would win the war. Now, this is 2 years before Pearl Harbor. At this point in time, 93% of the American public is staunchly against intervention, and there's a huge amount of political and public pressure on entertainment to not offend the Germans or the supporters or anything like that. Siegel and Shuster sent Superman through the Siegfried Line, the supposedly impregnable fortification line between Germany and France, right? He twists Nazi cannons into pretzels. He swats the Luftwaffe out of the sky like flies. He grabs Hitler and Stalin by the scruff of their necks like wayward children, right? This is back when they were still allies following the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which Hitler would break like 2.5 months later. And he brings them to stand trial for war crimes in front of the League of Nations. And it's great, it's great catharsis, right? It's great kind of imagination. But it's just a kid's comic book character in 1940 in this 2-page story. Who cares, right? The Nazis cared. So the SS had their own newspaper because when you want to take over the world, you got to do it in style, right? It was called the Das Schwarze Kopf, the Black Head. And in this newspaper, they wrote a full-page article, which may or may not have been written by Joseph Goebbels himself. And in it, they attack Superman as being a Jewish conspiracy to brainwash impressionable American youth with false Jewish values like protecting the innocent, helping the weak, showing compassion for others. You can't make this stuff up, right? The Nazis, think about it, they followed this warped Nietzschean idea of the Übermensch and Lebensraum, of might makes right, of survival of the fittest and natural selection. This was what Nietzsche called slave morality. For them, this was anathema. Superman's sense of justice was a warped version of reality. And this is amazing. According to popular legend, Goebbels even had a conniption about it in the middle of a Reichstag meeting. Either way, this was reported on very widely in the States, how these two Jewish youths managed to ruffle the feathers of the vaunted master race. And, at this point, Siegel, Jerry was already married, and, they're starting to get, they get death threats, they get hate mail. The German-American Bund is starting to picket DC's offices in New York. Just a year prior, they had a parade of 22,000 members down Fifth Avenue. This was a real threat. So you'd think they have a lot to lose. They're just a couple of young guys doing comics. Lay low, tone it down, back off. Not so much. Month after month, issue after issue, mostly on the covers, Superman attacked Nazis, beat them up, humiliated them, in this interesting mix of, righteous consecration, righteous anger, and cathartic glee, right? But they knew what they were doing, right? This was some genuine grade A chutzpah. But they were on a mission. If you look at these two Superman covers, these are World War I propaganda posters. They knew what they were doing. They had a mission. They had a message to get out. And once the United States finally joined the war, Superman comics became effectively regulation equipment. Out of 60 million American GIs, 8 million read comics regularly, and Superman outsold the rest 5-1 combined. Okay? You can find him in any PX, in any rucksack of any soldier. That's Elvis, by the way. That's guys in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge taking a break to read comics, because those are priorities. Superman needs to, And they started putting him on vehicles. They had him on tugboats, and on jeeps, and on tanks, and on airplanes, and on bombs. The United States Air Force Reserve 33rd Bombardment Squadron officially renamed itself the Superman Squad. And with Superman in so many GIs' back pockets, and on their bombs, and on their vehicles, and on their planes, he was right there on the front lines fighting Nazis in real life. And keep in mind, he was Jerry and Joe's avatar in fiction. He was literally created in their image, right? With them and through him, they were there on the front lines punching Nazis. Superman was effectively a golem, right? He was an imaginary bodyguard sent to protect his people. One created through, just like a golem, through language and art, except instead of sculpting and incanting, through writing and drawing. And instead of a man of clay, he was a man of steel. Now, as much as I love the metaphor, it is actually literal. In his unpublished memoir, Siegel discusses that one of his strong influences was the legend of the Golem of Prague. Specifically, the 1920 movie. There was a German movie called Der Golem, which was huge back then. And it really inspired him into creating his indestructible, indefatigable champion of the oppressed. And long before Superman was the Man of Steel, he was originally known as Champion of the Oppressed. That's his original tagline. And the legend of the Golem, particularly this version that's in the movie, was later, in 1958, used wholesale for the origin of one of Superman's enemies, Bizarro. Bizarro is this guy who looks like he could use a tan, the white guy, who is an artificial duplicate of Superman, created by mistake, who's well-meaning but too destructive and has to be stopped. And if you look at the original comic where he shows up, it's the story of the Golem one-to-one. They didn't bother changing anything except putting him in costume. So all of these themes move back and forth. But that's all Superman. We still have Clark Kent, who's half the equation. You can't have just one without the other. And as we said, Clark Kent is, he's anxious, he's neurotic, he's socially awkward, but he's also cerebral. He's bright, he's writerly. He fights for truth and justice as a journalist. He's a loyal friend. He's basically a burlesque of Jewish stereotypes. It's a whole checklist, right? Superman is essentially the story of the Jewish immigrant born Kal-El who comes over from the old country, anglicizes his name to Clark Kent, right? His costume is made from the fabrics his mother wrapped him in to put him in the vessel. That's his talit. It's his ethnic garb. He hides it under his clothes, just like a talit, right? And he assimilates because he looks enough like the dominant population to pass, which is something Jewish immigrants and very few others could do back then. The thing to do is to assimilate, right? We're thinking of 1940s. The default is WASP. That's just what was considered to be all-American. But Jews could pass. You come over, you comb your hair, you put your fedora on, you lose your Yiddish accent, and you're assimilated. You're Clark Kent. Right? And every time he decides this is a job for Superman and he opens his shirt, he's not just declaring the personal, he's declaring the ethnic and racial. From a person of Earth to a person of Krypton. Right? From an assimilated Gentile to a Jew. Superman is the ultimate assimilation / assertion fantasy. Cool, right? But wait, there's more. Superman is also a promise. Again, put yourself in the mindset of late 30s, early 40s. We have the Johnson-Reed Act that limits immigration. We already know what's going on in Europe. Superman was a promise to Americans that immigrants are not, as many at the time insisted, clannish, ungrateful, treacherous, fifth columnists, a burden, etc., etc. They are grateful. They only need to be taken in and shown the American way so they can champion it. They will pay it back. Superman is a story of an immigrant who brings with him the gifts of his heritage. His superpowers come from Krypton, not from Earth. And he uses them for the benefit of America and the world. He's a promise that taking in immigrants is the right thing to do. And he's a powerful reminder, now as well, that, this all-American icon, he's a powerful reminder that being an immigrant is all-American. So everything I just talked about is sort of the core themes, the core Jewish themes of Superman through the 30s and 40s, his formative years, and some of that has been discussed before me and some of that is not, but that's more or less where the story ends, which is a shame because there's tons more. It just has never been excavated. So I want to move forward into the 1950s. And if you think about it for a second, in the 1950s, American entertainment was very sanitized. Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, all these kind of... And my favorite example, I Love Lucy, right? Lucy and Desi were a real-life married couple, but in the show, they had twin beds separated by a nightstand. Right? That was the mentality of the time. So when people think of Superman of the 50s, this is the image they have in mind. Like, no, not a care in the world, insouciant, happy-go-lucky, he fights nonsense, and, catches the occasional bank robber that has like a domino mask and a striped shirt, that kind of thing. That's not the truth of it. Yeah, you could find some of that, but that's not the truth of it. The truth of it is that story after story, issue after issue, Superman was torn with survivor's guilt. He was desperately trying to save Krypton and failing, to discover more of his lost heritage, of his lost culture, to learn more and preserve more of what was lost. He was discovering other survivors like Supergirl. It's a famous Holocaust story we all know. My grandmother found out that one of her sisters survived years after. We all know these stories, right? Same idea. It was all post-Holocaust metaphor. It was all these creators after Holocaust coming to terms to things and digesting them through their work, as artists do. My favorite of these is actually one of the last stories written by Jerry Siegel, the co-creator of Superman. And it's in Superman number 149, November 1961, and it's called The Death of Superman. It's the first story that had that title, but you kind of repurposed it many times since. And it's also an imaginary story. It's a what if. They came up with these things because how can you change the status quo and not change the status quo? So you come up with an imaginary story, and then next month you're back to business as usual. And in this story, Lex Luthor, the dastardly villain, finally manages to murder Superman. And then he runs and he hides. Supergirl, who at that point is a secret, puts on a costume and goes on a clandestine operation to find Luthor. She finds him, she grabs him, and she brings him to stand trial. Not in Metropolis, not in the UN, not in The Hague. She brings him to stand trial in Kandor, which is a miniaturized survivors colony of Kryptonians that happens to number 6 million. He's put on trial, where he's told, you killed a Kryptonian, and therefore you shall be tried by Kryptonians. This story got published at the peak of the Eichmann trial. The highest ranking Nazi official to ever be caught and tried post-Nuremberg, who went to Buenos Aires and hid, got caught by the Israeli Mossad, kidnapped and brought to Jerusalem, put in a glass box just like Luthor, and told, with us here today are 6 million accusers. It's the same story. And in case it wasn't obvious enough, maybe to some of the younger readers, there's a panel where the judge even tells Luthor, you are the worst criminal since Adolf Eichmann. They refer to it as the trial of the century. The parallels are very obvious once you see them. If we move forward in time, because I could talk for hours about this stuff, and the book is full of many more examples. That's just, giving you a shtickle. As we go to the 70s, things start becoming more and more explicit. In 1975, Superman visits Israel, laughably archaic Israel. Everybody's a Hasid pushing an apple cart or something. It's really funny. Being born and raised in Israel, not everybody's a Hasid pushing an apple cart, in case you've never been. Where he meets the very first ever explicitly Jewish superhero, Seraph, who gets his superpowers from biblical artifacts, the Ring of Solomon, the Staff of Moses, the Mantle of Elijah, and long hair like Samson. Although they gave him like a Beatles haircut for some reason, but that's the character. There's another story where we learned that in Krypton's ancient past, Kryptonians were enslaved by the pharaonic sounding Takane, who under the yoke of whips forced them to build a ziggurat pyramid. And how did they gain freedom? A plague of hives. Come on, right? It becomes more and more explicit, but also more and more playful. There's a very silly story where we find out that all Kryptonians come from an Adam and Eve called Kryp and Ton, These two stranded astronauts that landed there. And it's supposed to be silly, but... And there's another one where we find that Superman, Kal-El, and Fal-Jor-El, they're descendants of a prophet called Jaf-El, also from Krypton's ancient past, who warned Kryptonians of their ancient ways and worship of false idols. And then a flood comes and kills everybody. The twist is that flying animals save the people rather than the other way around. But it becomes more explicit and more playful. My favorite of this is a story from 1984 from Superman 400. It's the October 1984 anniversary issue, and it's called Miracle Monday. And in Miracle Monday, we visit the far-flung future, the year 5972. And in it, we find that humanity celebrates Superman with a holiday called Miracle Monday. It's a spring festival, celebrated the third Monday of every May, in honor of Superman not just saving humanity time and time again, but, I quote, teaching us how to live as a free people. The youngest of the family then stands up and says, this night is different from all other nights. I'm glad you're with me. Then the father of the family, named Herzog, who just so happens to look like Chaim Herzog, the president of Israel at the time, stands up and makes a toast and says, let all who are hungry come and eat. That's verbatim. That's the Kol Dichfin. And then they symbolically put a portion of their food on a plate aside until Superman's return, like the glass of wine for Elijah. And obviously this is the Seder, right? The guy who wrote this story, Eli Esmagen, who is Jewish, he's a student of Martin Buber, of Kabbalah, he's a very educated Jew, and he was the primary creative force as a writer on Superman after Jerry Siegel. He was really the main Superman writer for 15 years, from the early 70s to the mid-80s. And I interviewed him recently, and he said, Superman being Jewish is so self-evident, it might as well be canon. And there's more. Again, there's so much more, and I go into it in the book. We don't have the time. Jack Kirby, maybe the most famous artist in comic book history, had a whole spin-off of Superman called The Fourth World in the 70s, lasted 4.5 years, in which he based benevolent space gods on Jewish archetypes, like you see here, and malevolent space gods on Nazi archetypes, like you see here. Supernatural communication devices were based on tefillin, like you see there. That's a whole lecture in itself, just that work. In the 90s, there was this long storyline, also written by Peter David, a Jew, his mother is Israeli, where Supergirl gets actually deputized as a literal angel, as an agent of Shekhinah, of the manifestation of God. She becomes a literal angel to enact his justice. She even possibly meets God in the form of a little boy called Wally, supposedly a play on Yahweh. It's not, but that was a playful little thing. It was a really weird, but very, very interesting storyline. In 1998, for Superman's 50th anniversary, they decided to finally let him do what he was created to do and never got to, and they sent him back to Warsaw to rescue the Jews. And of course, the story ends with him not being able to because of time travel logic, because if he does, where are you with the story, right? So it has to be this kind of built-in impossibility. And he goes back in time, and the story, it's a 3-issue story, Superman the Man of Steel 80 through 82, and it's full of historical reference. If you look at this panel at the bottom right, that's based on the famous Warsaw Ghetto Boy photo. So there's a lot of historical reference. He meets Mordechai Yankelevich, the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion, and all these kind of things. However, this storyline actually created a big uproar and ended up being denounced by the ADL because nowhere in the 3 issues do they ever mention Jews. It's always euphemistic language like the victims or the dead or whatever they use. DC Comics was trying so hard not to offend anyone that they offended everybody. And there's a lot of bad press, and they had to issue an apology. As the comic book industry continued to grow and evolve and become a bigger and bigger business, it became less and less Jewish. It became more respectable. More people started coming into it from different backgrounds, and they brought their own kind of cultural blueprints. And it's all good. It's enriched. But the Jewish themes can still be found. This may be based on Michelangelo assisting Chapel, but that's still the creation of Adam from Genesis. That's still a Jewish story. Okay? There was a storyline in 2019 that I like to point to, written by Brian Michael Bendis, who's from Cleveland. He is a former Orthodox yeshiva student who got his start as an illustrator in bar mitzvahs. He would doodle the caricatures. He became a writer. In 2019, there was this long storyline that he wrote, how there's a flaring up of hidden anti-Kryptonianism amongst the various alien races of the galaxy. Sounds familiar? Same guy, a couple years later, and this is a blow-up of a one panel. You blink and you miss it. Where Perry White, the editor-in-chief of the Daily Planet, he's Clark Kent and Lois Lane's boss, he's complaining that a story is late and he's going to be late for Shabbat dinner. That's a very odd thing for a Gentile to complain about. And this looks big, but in the comic it's like a tiny little panel. And it wasn't even in like a main Superman title, it was like a spin-off. It's a blink and you miss, but that's where they hide these little things, right? There was one storyline in 2005 where Superman actually literally attends a Shabbat dinner in the comics. A Daily Planet staffer invites him over. He puts on a yarmulke, the Yiddish Shama shovels kugel onto his plate, which he dutifully eats. And he does the kiddush with them. He's familiar with the kiddush. But it's supposed to be like a duck out of water. He's not supposed to literally be Jewish. And actually, nobody in DC noticed that it's a big faux pas to ring the electric buzzer on Shabbat. So, after going through this whole journey, simple question, is Superman Jewish? And the very Jewish answer is, depends. Right? And it depends which Superman. And I don't mean Clark Kent or Superman. I don't mean the original Superman or post-reboot 1986 TV Superman. I don't mean that. What I mean is the real Superman or the imaginary Superman. The imaginary Superman in the comics is not Jewish. First of all, he's an alien. He might as well be a dolphin. God knows he could be Jewish, right? And he canonically is Christian. He was raised in Kansas. Not many Jews in Kansas. I looked it up. It's 0.6%, if you didn't know. And he's canonically a non-practicing Methodist or Protestant. He went to church as a kid. He's not practicing as an adult. He's seen too much to be dogmatic. And that's what Superman is. But that's the imaginary, the fictional Superman. There's also a real Superman, by which I mean a comic book character in the real world. An IP, if you will. That character, that Superman in the real world is absolutely Jewish. He's a Jewish character. He was created by Jews. He was largely developed by Jews. He was imbued with many, many Jewish themes and symbolisms. Again, I just covered a little bit. There's a ton in the book. His DNA is Jewish. So it will always be Jewish. And why is that even important? You must be wondering, and I'm glad you asked, I'll tell you. Because it means that those comics are Jewish literature. They are part of the same canon as Primo Levi and Bernard Malamud and Saul Bellow. It's the same people of the same backgrounds writing about the same things. It's just through hyperbole and metaphor, and it's for kids. But it's the same bagel and the same bagel cart and the same street corner. It's the same stuff. They deserve a place on the same shelf as American Jewish literature. Thank you. So let's open it up for questions, and I'm happy to answer anything. Yes, lady in the hat.
In the Smallville show where he's hung on a cross, why doesn't he have the strength to take himself off the cross? Or whatever that thing is.
That's a very legitimate question, right? He's Superman, and he already has some burgeoning powers as a teenager in that point in time. It's because a shard of kryptonite was found years earlier and fashioned into a necklace that his high school crush, Lana Lang, is wearing, and somebody put it on him. So he doesn't even realize what's going on, so he's enfeebled, and therefore he's, and you can read into that metaphor in all kinds of ways. But if you allow me, I'll use that as a segue. What's kryptonite? It's remnant of his planet. And the planet, his alien origins, what gives him power. That's where his superpowers come from. It's not from Earth. And it followed him from the old world into the new world, and it's the only thing that not only can hurt him, but also expose him. There's so many stories where Clark Kent's secret identity is almost exposed because kryptonite is around, right? That is a metaphor for the old world and the old tradition. I'm not even going into kryptonite versus crypto Jews and how that's the symbol. You come over from the Shtetlach, and then, your parents embarrass you because they only speak Yiddish, and you want to be all American, and you want to assimilate, And every time you come to school smelling of locks, it exposes you, right? Your Jewish culture, your tradition is a source of pride and strength, but also it's what pigeonholes you and limits you and gets you exposed to anti-Semitism, maybe getting hurt, and maybe you have a love-hate relationship with it if you are a first-generation American in the 40s. So in my eyes, kryptonite is one big metaphor. And if you think about it, it only works as a metaphor because why would it be popular? It's Superman can lift mountains and he flies faster than a jet. His biggest enemy is a rock, right? He's in a comic called Action Comics and it's about a man fighting a mineral. Like the whole point of the thing is that it's a powerful metaphor. It wouldn't work otherwise. That's a long answer, but hopefully it worked. Who else had a question? Yes?
First, thank you for profoundly fascinating and wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I'm a longtime Superman fan, learned a whole bunch of new things. I'm curious though, in the DVD commentary of Superman the movie, Tom Mankiewicz, who is essentially the script doctor
Right.
for Superman the movie, goes at length about using Superman, about injecting the Christ metaphor into the Superman mythos. Can you speak on that and whether or not that was the first time anyone thought to do that at least in terms of a major pop culture?
It's a great question. I can talk about it and I shall. The irony of all ironies. There is nothing Christ-like about Superman in any and by the way, I have an article, you can find it on my website, it's myname.com, it's royschwartz.com, that basically traces every single Christian metaphor in Superman when they started showing up and just traces that evolutionary tree. And for some reason, nobody ever did it before. People wrote entire books about Superman as Jesus, and nobody actually bothered to look where that came from. So I did. And aside from the general idea of sent down from the heavens, and aside from the general idea of being raised in a humble, so farmers, carpenters, whatever, there's nothing Christ-like about Superman until 1978, until the movie. And the irony of it is that the original script was written by Mario Puzo, the same guy who wrote The Godfather, who was a Catholic, and he put nothing Christ in it. And then come Richard Donner, the director, born Richard Schwarzbalt in the Bronx, and Tom Mankiewicz, the script doctor, who wrote many of the Roger Moore, James Bond films, and they start putting Christ in. So a couple of Jews from New York putting Christ in it. It's really very weird. But they did it on their own accord, and they started putting in all these Christ metaphors, thinking that it would appeal to the Goyishes. That was their general kind of thought. But they overdid it to such an extent that one, Richard Donner got death threats. You do this kind of stuff, there's always people, And number two, it never left. And it just took off from there. But that's really the origin. Before then, there's nothing Christ-like anywhere. Yeah?
Well, what about Jonathan and Martha? For Mary and Joseph?
Right, and Martha was the sister of, right? But that came a bit later, in the 50s, so that's one of the evolutionary steps. No. So in the original comic, he's found by a passing motorist and then dropped off in an orphanage.
The first one, yeah.
And then it's a couple that's not named. And then in the radio show, it's Eben and Sarah. And then so there's a whole evolutionary tree, and then eventually it's, Jonathan and Martha, named separately, not at the same time, in the comics.
When does that, about what year?
54.
What?
54.
54.
Yeah, so that's pretty late in the game. 38 is when he showed up. And again, it's all great, but that's not. It's not original. It's not in the roots. Yeah.
So how do things turn out for Joe?
That's a loaded question.
Financially.
Not well. And we actually have some family members of theirs with us in the audience, but not well. The very, very short version, just because that's its own lecture. That could be a multi-part lecture. And there's, the legal questions and the ethical questions, there's a lot to it. But the very, very simplified short version, when those 13 pages that DC Comics were just in a scramble to fill in, and they just paid them the page rate of $10 a page times 13 pages for $130, and with it bought the rights for Superman forever. And that led to, beginning in 1948 and ending in 2016, led to what is arguably the single longest IP litigation in history. So it was a cluster of litigations, it wasn't one single one. It got resolved in a way. If it's just or not, that's not for me to say. Siegel's family does own something. Schuster's family, unfortunately, does not. For a character who champions truth and justice and spawned an entire industry characters fighting and symbolizing justice, he was born from this original sin of injustice. So yeah, they did not, they got their brainchild stolen from them. It's a very heartbreaking story. Yes?
Can't you compare him to an angel? Maybe all angels are like that.
Sure. Well, what are some names of angels that you know?
Gabriel, Uriel.
Gabriel, Uriel, Kal-El. Yeah. By the way, I do want to add one thing, that the last interview that Joe Shuster, that was the co-storyteller and artist. The last interview he gave was the Toronto Daily Star, which he worked for as a child, and actually was the base for the Daily Planet. And the Daily Planet was originally called the Daily Star in the comics. And he was a very sweet guy. He was sort of impossibly sweet. And his very last words on record is that he can't feel too bad knowing so many children enjoy his work. And that gets it right here. Yeah.
So many children
Enjoy his work.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's interesting that a number of eminent Christian biblical scholars are now saying that it's obvious that a lot of the incidents in the life of Jesus, Yeshua, of Nazareth, were deliberately paralleling things that happened in Moses' life. But in fact, they even did that throughout, what's that book? Anyway, they would come to the church, the synagogues, in those early years, the Jewish Christians, and they would have their own thing, and they'd get up and the lesson of the day and so forth would literally parallel the readings and things that were being done in the synagogue, by the traditional Jewish rabbis and so forth. And they would deliberately put forth stories and so say, wow, that's exactly what happened to Moses. He's 40 days in the wilderness, right? And anyway, the consensus now growing among some of these serious Christian, biblical scholars is that was very deliberate to model him and to show, see, the same things happen to him as happened to Moses, And they were trying to make a point.
Yeah, no, it is a good point. So I talk about this in my book quite at length. Let's treat Moses and Jesus for a second as literary characters, because I don't want to step on any of these toes, right? Literary characters. In literature, there's something called typology, from type, right? Or morphology. Jesus is a retake of Moses. We got a sequel, you gotta love it. That kind of attitude. And if you look at the story of Jesus, right, there's the massacre of the innocent, right? King Herod kills the innocents of Bethlehem, and he has to run into the desert, and it's very similar to Moses. And he has the 40 days in the desert where the devil tries to tempt him, and it's very similar. He's born to simple people. He's descendant of greatness. Moses is descendant of Noah. If you don't know, Jesus is David. And they both have these big things going on a mountain with all kinds of omens and lights going on, the Sermon on the Mount and the Ten Commandments. They both become, and they're both considered very humble. Right? The Bible says that Moses was the most humble man, which I think is hilarious because it's not humble to say I'm the most humble man, but okay. So from that perspective, as a literary perspective, one is absolutely based on the other, to the point where today somebody would sue somebody, right? Like it's very, very, very similar. So in that sense, Superman is just continuing that tradition. And if you asked Carl Jung, he would say all three of them come from the same collective unconscious, these primordial ideas of humanity that we all think in similar patterns, right? And it's all good. But I explore all these possibilities in the book. Yes?
By the way, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And I haven't read your book, and I've got to go out to it now.
So they're selling the book in the room after this, after 3 books. Please support our local.
One more thing I think people might enjoy knowing, and you may well have this in there, but back in 1973, when I was working for Cleveland Magazine, I actually went and did the research at Glenville High School. The yearbooks were gone, so I said, well, wasn't there a student paper? Oh, the Glenville Torch, bound issues, right? They bring them all out. I'm going through there, and Jerry Siegel's byline is everywhere, and there are mentions of other people, Lois all the time, and things like that. And so those guys were out in California at the time, Siegel and Schuster in 73, and they were incommunicado. You could not get them. We dedicated. Well, that's another story. But anyway, and so I had to track down old classmates of theirs who had worked, looked for the bylines in the Glenville Torch. And a number of these people were still alive and still around, and one of them, Jerry Schwartz, in those days,
No relation.
his actual name was Jerome Lawrence Schwartz. And as Jerome Lawrence, he went on to write Inherit the Wind, Andy Vane, a whole bunch of other things. A number of these people had illustrious careers, who all these kids working on the Glenville Torch. And one of the things I found out that was confirmed by Lawrence and the rest of them was that, oh yeah, we all knew Lois Lane was inspired by Lois Amster, who sat next, and Clark Kent by Jerry's best pal, whose name was Wilson Hirschfeld, who went on to become managing editor of the Plain Dealer. And another one of the kids who wrote the sports stuff for the Glenville Torch became the sports editor, Hal Lebowitz. And other things.
All Irishmen.
Anyway, and then years later, a colleague of mine at public radio actually tracked down Lois Amster, who was married, an older woman at that point. The last name was Rothschild, living in Beechwood, and interviewed her for Cleveland Public Radio.
That's very cool.
So in other words, it goes back even further, but I love the way you brought out all of the charities, because those guys all confirmed that. Oh, that's what we talk about. We'd be sitting on the front porch having a glass of tea, and the old folks would be talking about Europe and all of this stuff, and they were just, bathed in this constantly, their heritage.
They were. So first of all, thank you for all that. That's some great info. And yeah, Lois was a composite character. She had all kinds of, there was some movie actors, there's Lola Lane and Torchy Blaine, a movie series, and her personality really came from a model that Joe hired to pose so he could draw, and they kind of got that spark a little bit. So it's a composite character like everything else. One thing I can definitely tell you is that they were very well aware of what was going on in Europe. There's sometimes in retrospect we're not quite sure. Everybody knew exactly what was going on very early on. The press didn't care, but the community knew. And Jerry and Joe very early on knew, and when they were putting Superman together, the idea of fighting against that particular injustice was absolutely part of the equation, consciously and deliberately, no question. It's in their writing. Any other questions? Yes.
I don't know.
I want to hear from this side next. Yeah.
Said before, I came in a pinch late, but is Superman circumcised?
Oh, you missed the beginning.
Yeah.
Hold on, just for the lady. Just for the lady. Oh, it's too late. Oh well. Never mind. Sorry. Listen, bottom line is you'd have to ask Lois. I don't know, but metaphorically, yes. Metaphorically, yes. Yeah. Yes.
Do you have a preference of actor who portrayed Superman over the years?
I do. Christopher Reeve. And I describe it in the book is that he wasn't an actor cast as Superman. The director reached into the comic and pulled Superman out. That's how it felt. And I was very validated a couple of nights ago when Jerry Siegel's daughter, in a conversation with Samantha Baskin, said that he was also their family's favorite actor, including many into the 90s. So yeah, I think that's the guy. Yeah. Yes?
There's some talk about the black Superman
There is.
now. Yeah.
So, Superman culturally is something like a meme. He's an icon. And we have an icon, you want to be iconoclastic, for better and for worse. So what's a meme? Is something that stays the same but constantly gets new context, right? So there's a character in the comics called Val Zod, which is the Superman of an alternate dimension. And he's black, and he was originally designed based on Barack Obama. It's a whole interesting thing. Not getting into politics, just saying.
Is he circumcised?
And man, there's like 3 jokes in my head right now. And there's a script that was written, and it was supposed to be produced by J.J. Abrams, who's director, and it was supposed to be, that's rumors, that was never, it was supposed to be a movie a few years ago before so DC is owned by Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers had some big changing of the guard. It was supposed to be arguably a TV movie, maybe a theatrical release, not the Superman, but a Superman. They officially don't say anything. I would sign off that it's dead in the water. There's no way they're going to do it. For including some recent political things that we're not even going to get into now. But yes, I don't think it's happening. Yes, any other questions? Could be about Superman Schmeckel or about something else. Other characters. If you're around, two things. I will be signing books in the room behind Apple Tree, which is your friendly neighborhood local bookstore is selling them, so please support them. And the Cleveland, is it Philharmonic or? Please.
So if anyone would like to stay, as many of you might know, the Cleveland Orchestra had to cancel its planned trip to Israel. And so instead today they're doing a day of music. They're going to be here at the Temple for a series of performances from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. There are no tickets needed, it's free, but they are asking people to think of making donations to is it called the Israel Emergency Fund?
Yeah.
Yes, which is, of course, Jewish Federation of Cleveland's fund specifically to support Israel in this terrible, terrible moment.
Yes, and as an Israeli born and raised, I ask you, please help.
So I hope you do that. Join us in the library for sales and signing. We have a little nosh in front of the gallery on your way out. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Starting here, right?
Yes. Sorry.
You make the same two people. Oh, this is. Yeah, nice work up there.
I'm going to bring this into the library.
Oh, okay.
Right next to
Thank you.
Roy when he signs.
Can I take the extra water? Is that okay?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So this is a piece of book art. Okay. And for us, this is a really amazing gift.
Oh, okay.
What is that?